Welcome, everyone, to episode 90 of Underserved. Joining me today is Joseph Frascati, CIO and technology leader. Let's get started.
Welcome to this week's edition of Underserved, the podcast for the rest of the tech industry, where we focus on stories of tech industry leaders, their insights, and their lessons learned. And now, your host, Andrew Jelina.
Joseph, thank you so much for joining me today on Underserved.
Thank you so much for having me. I've become a big fan as I got exposed to the podcast. I've been gobbling up all the episodes lately.
Oh, thank you very much. So at a young age, you were kind of bouncing all over the country. What was that like?
I learned early that I liked tech. I loved gadgets, but I was not an engineer. I learned that I had musical aptitude, so I focused on music as a kid. And we did move around a lot, and I got really comfortable with change. I can draw some lines as to how that affects me as a professional today. To put a little color to that, as a kid, I loved electronics, toys. I'm so envious of people who, when they were kids, they took things apart and put them back together again, or maybe they fixed something that wasn't working in the garage. I remember I got a digital watch, which was the biggest deal in like 1979 or 1980 or whenever those things came out. And before the day was over, I took it apart and it never worked again. Back then, we had like Coleco football games that were handheld. And I remember just the mystery of wanting to know how those lights worked. Took that thing apart. That never worked again. As a kid, you're asked, what do you want to do when you grow up? My dad was a doctor, and I just remember thinking, man, if I'm this bad with electronics, I have no business dealing with what's inside a human being. But I did have some musical aptitude, and I learned discipline. I learned about being in front of people. I started to get into classical music. I studied classical guitar. Now, for folks that don't know, the classical guitar is also known as the Spanish guitar. It's an acoustic instrument. It's a very mellow, very pleasant sounding instrument. Yeah, it did teach me discipline. It did teach me what it's like to kind of manage a crowd and be on stage. But we did move around a lot. That taught me how to be comfortable with change. And I kind of cut my teeth on understanding the social aspect of things by being a little bit more of an observer because my scenery was changing so much. And so I wanted to see the equivalent version of this person from one school to the next school or one state to the next state, personality-wise, how things worked within a clique, how cliques worked within each other, and even how the faculty worked. You know, they were awfully consistent and had the same buttons that one could push. And so I think just realizing that things are kind of the same all over, I realized I also learned how to negotiate kind of early, whether that was having a bad grade because I was joining mid-year and talking myself out of them giving me a lower mark than I wanted, different cards to play. Oh, I've been moving. It's really hard on me, you know, stuff like that, right? And you whip out the classical musician card and they're always impressed with that. So little by little, I did sort of subconsciously realize I was learning some effective ways of negotiation.
Classical guitar is not known to be lucrative, so you get into retail after that?
I was a decent musician. But I did start to struggle with playing a piece of music over and over and over. I also developed like a desire for things, exotic cars being the biggest thing. So for me as a teenager, by this point, I'm realizing that, you know, the big money isn't in the classical music. And I bail on music. I end up at this startup-y retail company. They grew from 24 locations to 350, 360 in the time that I was there. That's really where I cut my teeth on business and operations. You know, my compensation was based on store sales in my region, kickers for staying within, you know, below certain tolerances for operating costs, expanding into new markets and new store openings. So I really learned a lot here. The other thing I learned was the business value of tech. This was mid to late 90s, so that gives you an idea as to the state of technology at the time. But I really saw tech as an amplifier of human capability. Like when you go to the airport and they have that human conveyor belt thing, you know, you can stand on that and be like a human Pringles can in a factory, just kind of going down, or you can walk on it, and thus increasing your ambulatory efficiency, right? And when we implemented merchandising systems and point of sale systems, it changed how effective we could be with getting the right SKUs to the right store, backfilling fast to clear out things that were selling quickly, knowing when our pricing was wrong. Those were the things that I really gravitated more to towards the end than just the business ops. I will say, when you're growing a retail company, boy, what a challenge in terms of personnel. It's high turnover. You really need people to show up and open the door. And you want altruistic workers who, aren't going to create a negative environment for a guest. Interviewing was okay, but I started to come up with audition scripts for certain job types so that we could see these folks for who they are in more of a real life situation, not an interview situation. And around this time, I coincidentally had talked to our accountant who mentioned, oh yeah, I used to be something else. I was so miserable. I went to a therapist, I took a personality test, and I realized that I should be doing this. And so he changed careers. And I thought, there's really something to this notion that some people are kind of some ways. And I started to think, how do you try to put some science to this to get more predictable and get more desirable outcomes with how you put teams together and who you bring into the organization. So, off to the bookstore I went, MyersBriggs, DISC, and other things that I did sort of some self-education on.
Is that the one that produces one of 15 personality types?
The one that I kind of landed on, something called predictive index. There's really no one better than the other. The whole idea of this stuff is to just understand the best attributes in people and kind of understand, generally speaking, what somebody is. There are different personality types. A lot of people can do kind of anything. They can stretch beyond what their type is. But for the most part, people are going to be relatively in their comfort zone. For example, some people are venturers. That's what I am. Some people are altruistic. Some folks are craftspeople, and they really want to hone in on the craft and maybe not deal with the management and the business side and the other things. And ultimately, when people are doing the things that they feel most comfortable with, they tend to be the most productive and the most happy.
So from there, you move on to Silicon Graphics. I remember them back in the day.
So at SGI, I learned enterprise business systems. I really got bit by the business systems bug. Really wanted to get exposed to more of that. As luck would have it, a friend of mine worked at Silicon Graphics in sales and marketing. He tells me that they need an analyst to help with a troubled CRM implementation. I know nothing about what this guy's talking about. Words are flying around that I don't understand, but he mentions Siebel CRM. I kid you not, Siebel was across the street from my apartment building in San Mateo. So I go to the lobby. I notice in the reception area, there's a little presentation stack of discs, installation discs. So I grab one of those. I buy a laptop at Best Buy because the system requirements exceeded my lousy laptop that I had. Install it, and I just try to understand as much about how this thing works as possible, memorize all the field names and all that kind of stuff. I returned the laptop, and during the interview, I was able to speak somewhat intelligently to what this application did and got the job and spent 5 really wonderful years at a company with a great corporate culture.
Well, I think everyone that touched Siebel around that time has some battle scars. I was involved with some Siebel stuff at Monster back then, and still gives me the willies once in a while.
Yeah. I think coming from the business side a bit, it maybe made me a little bit more empathetic to what those users were going through. That role in general, it was like another level of education for me. I'm not managing people anymore. It's less money. It's very humbling. But you have to learn how to be effective when people don't report to you. So, still tapping into those developing skills I had around how to work with people, especially in a broad environment. And boy, I'll tell you that the real test of that, they didn't exactly explain in the interview process that it was somewhat of a failed implementation and that it needed some repair. And what we found is, it wasn't always the software. Not only was it the first CRM implementation at SGI, so you can imagine the average sales rep at the time giving the company a bunch of information about their contacts, letting them be big brother, not really on their mind, not really something that they had on their to-do list.
I'm not putting my activity into the system.
Exactly. I can empathize with this, right? It's like, what if some of these deals I enter into the system don't pan out? I want to hedge a little bit, all those things that I completely understand. The second thing that made this a challenge was it was the first deployment of anything that ran on Windows at that company. For folks who don't know, SGI had its own brand of Unix called IRIX, and workers used Silicon graphics workstations at their desks. And they're all like using Unix commands and stuff like that to do their day-to-day job. So not only was it the resistance from sales, but we would hear things like, well, this is our first step towards allegiance with the devil. Bill Gates was the devil. So we improved it. We ended up taking a future version of Siebel live globally. I think it was called Siebel 2003, maybe, web-based. And we did a global CPQ solution from Trilogy Software for some pretty complex configuration. But the thing I learned early on, because I watched how some of the people who were there that did the implementation handled some of these complaints, I just started agreeing with the people that were complaining. Get the defenses down. Try to be empathetic and understand what it is they're talking about. Yes, 50% of it is emotional, but that really allowed us to get to the facts about what has to change. And by asking them, how would this have to work for this to be of value to you? That's really how we came up to get that thing straightened out. And eventually, when that turned into a global deployment and consolidation of CRM systems, not only was that a great opportunity to make things better for the reps that we had been working with through the first implementation, but then it got us exposure to the partner folks, the channel folks, and the sales folks in the different geographies. I certainly learned a thing or two about the dynamics that can exist between Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the UK. Not to mention, my own sort of personal take on Japan, which was a group of people that really didn't want to do things until it was right. So some differences in the dynamics was a very good thing for me to get exposed to at that time.
You are listening to the Underserved podcast. Underserved is produced by MyersBriggs Consulting Group, embracing the power of people in technology. For more information, visit MyersCG.com. That's MARISCG.com.
Yeah, everyone thinks that deploy to a new country. We just got to do some internationalization and
right.
A couple database tweaks and we're done. No, the processes and the people, everything's got to come along.
From a centralized systems perspective, we were unaware. Of course, the local business leaders, had these practices where, you uplift your pricing so that you can do deeper discounting. Just to give you one example, right? Well, that required business process changes and changes on the pricing and ERP side. It wasn't just something that affected the front office. And then there's little things that, to this day, I can't say I'm an expert on, but we just noticed some patterns of if Germany wanted to do this, then maybe France didn't want to. So we had to work through things like that as well.
So where do you move on to from there?
Yeah, well, when I was at SGI and I did more of this personality work and behavioral traits work, and I started to realize that I would be more satisfied ultimately in my career in some sort of leadership role. So I had an opportunity to go to a company called Electronics for Imaging. Great company, huge footprint on the print industry, whether that's embedded chipsets for copiers and printers, manufacturing-wide printers, or a host of software solutions that are used in the print industry. Now, they had done this great job of acquiring all these companies in the print industry, but those acquisitions weren't necessarily folded in. So you can have sort of a persistent divisionalized culture. They had tried to consolidate the CRM side 2 times before I joined. So apparently I'm a glutton for punishment. But it was an opportunity for me to get back to people management, continue to hone my skills on project execution, and build a front office apps function, which didn't exist at that company prior. We also realized as we went through it that Siebel at that point in time wasn't going to work. We looked at NetSuite. We settled on Salesforce.com. So it was a great opportunity, it turned out. We were told to buy Salesforce at the time. It was the first enterprise-wide deployment of Salesforce.com. When I say enterprise-wide, I mean marketing, sales, professional services, support, the full gamut. I exercised what I gathered about team dynamics to build a full-time team, but, I applied that also to the consultants and partners, even to the point of team selection being done by putting them through the audition process I talked about earlier, because I really wanted to make sure that we had a team dynamic, and it doesn't really matter whose badge you have, like what color your badge is. It's about getting everybody to work together as a team. And you can imagine how big that project was considering all those functions I mentioned. Another great thing is that came out of this is I use a lot of those partners even to this day. So some wonderful, long-lasting relationships have occurred from that. But I really did start to hone in on that audition process where it's less about an interview. We started to prep people that there would be an audition, but we didn't want it to be a situation where we told them the subject matter, had them do a bunch of research while we sat there and had a presentation delivered to us. This was much more about, hey, let's just see what they're like. Do they respond or acknowledge or forget about the person who's on the speakerphone that's not in the room? Do they take verbal input, and can they turn that into, say, a process flow? And there's no right or wrong about that. You may get the process flow completely wrong. You'll still get a job offer potentially. It's more about we just like to know more about who you are and how you function and how you are in a meeting. And you can tailor those differently for different kinds of roles. It's just kind of funny as I think about this. When I really first started to roll this out, I noticed that when we transitioned from interview to the audition part, all of a sudden I can smell like their deodorant or their shampoo, or like that's when people start sweating. I know, and it's not intentionally a stress test. It's just, can we just drop all the fronts that we put up and just have a real face-to-face discussion about something real? And, if we ask somebody to go to whiteboard and do a process flow and we try to role play. I'll pretend to be a salesperson. You pretend to be the business analyst. It is at least for me, it's proven to be more effective than just doing traditional Q&A in an interview setting.
Now, after that, you get some experience working with the Stevedores. That's a term that I had forgotten about.
Yeah, 5 points to our listeners who know what Stevedoring is. I know I didn't. So I had this opportunity to get involved with a company called the Stratafusion Group. They're an executive IT consulting firm, mostly CIOs who are in between CIO roles or former CIOs. Since I had the ultimate goal of being a CIO, I figured these are the people that I really need to be around. I got some exposure to them. They liked what I did in a particular case, and they said, hey, we have some opportunities to work with us. These were, a mix of opportunities to round out my experience. So I had the opportunity to be a temporary director of infrastructure for 9 months, where there was some health check that we needed to perform, some, things we needed to deploy, some cleanup. That was an opportunity for me to get some IT infra experience. Then we had the Stevedoring company, Ports America. Really interesting story where some people may remember there were some news stories during the George W. Bush administration where Saudis were controlling American ports and people were up in arms about it. Well, what they ended up doing is it launched some sort of a mandate for some of those terminals to be operated by an American company. That launched a bidding war. And the company that, quote unquote, won was High Star Capital. And what they ended up with was over 100 different terminals in the United States. Some of those had been, previously sort of consolidated under one company. But once they got it and they paid a hefty penny for it, then it was like, okay, now what do you do? Do you try to run these things separately with redundant financial operations to each side, et cetera, et cetera? So they made the decision to create a shared services center, eliminate, too many of the redundant positions, eliminate unnecessary redundant positions and centralize those. And the project I was involved in was getting everything on a single GL, consolidating from over 100 companies down to roughly, 5, 6, 7, single instance of Oracle ERP R12. And this really was an opportunity to observe, two big things. One of them was I walked in the door with the project midway through. They had just hired a chief process officer that told them he wants to move the go live date in by 6 months. The team agrees. I'm hearing this like on my first day. I don't know what's going on. Schedules are adjusted, everything's adjusted to try to accommodate this, but it does become kind of clear that we're trying to put 20 pounds worth of sand in a 10-pound bag. And, lots of personalities involved, business leadership, IT leadership, but ultimately it became pretty clear we weren't going to make it. We ended up with the original go live date that the team had sort of sized up. And there was some fallout from that. Some people that signed up for it and kept reporting green statuses were promoted to customer. But an interesting thing happened when that go live date was blown. The chief process officer said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I want to take a look at the personality types and create a new project leadership. And I was like, whoa, I'm kind of into that. I've seen the benefit of being more mindful towards team dynamics. And that's where I heard about Predictive Index, was through him. He wanted it deployed. He had HR adopting it. And this was my first exposure to a more formalized approach with executive sponsorship. So we put a project team in place of a project manager, an IT leader, which was me, a finance leader, which was the VP of FP&A at the time. And we were tasked with getting this thing done. So, unfortunate that it had to unfortunately miss its go live date. But I also learned, you really want to be transparent with folks when you know it's not going to make it. You don't have to necessarily publicly announce it. You don't have to make it an emotional battle, but you do want to knock on their door, walk in and say, you know what, I'm really seeing this. I'm with you 100% on trying to make this happen, but no matter how much money we throw at this, we may not make this. So I think it's really important, if you're representing the IT function, to try to be as transparent as you can about what you're seeing. Now, you got to come with a solution, of course. So whether that's, hey, go back to the original date that you had, or maybe it's, hey, if we could pull this lever or pull this lever. I can share an example later on about an adjustment we made where we didn't get the date we wanted, but we took a subset of functionality live. There are different things you can do.
Reducing features is almost always one of the go-to moves in that scenario. So with Stratafusion, did you get exposure to some other industries as well?
Yeah. So I don't want to exit the ports discussion without clarifying Stevedoring is the service of loading and unloading shipment vessels, ocean-bound shipment vessels. So after we get Ports America all straightened out with their ERP, another similar opportunity was looming at a company called Harmonic. Huge footprint in the digital video space. Definitely a company worth looking into. Very cool. Had an opportunity to do another post-acquisition CRM consolidation, preparation for an ERP upgrade, but a knock on my door from Zendesk happened. A small company that I hadn't heard of at that point in time. It was an opportunity to join another startup. Since the retail days, where I was at a rapidly growing startup kind of environment, I had been doing kind of cleanup work, right? I mean, very interesting work, larger scale work, but the opportunity to be in a pure build, GSD, get stuff done kind of an environment was very appealing. So I joined, and IT was involved in moving some of the custom coded pricing into more of commoditized solutions like Swara for subscription management and pricing calculation. Zendesk acquired a company called Zopim Chat. So we worked on the integration there. The ability to charge in multiple currencies, and really proud of the team's work in cooperation with engineering on a lot of those things, because there was a lot of touch points with core product. And Zendesk was really, the place I learned how to manage millennials. It was a hip San Francisco startup, different age ranges than I was used to dealing with in the past. A really good precursor to, the next 10 years of my life, where I wanted to I had the fortune of having a better understanding as to how to work with this kind of new crop of professionals. So that was a great experience. There was one takeaway. I did observe when certain security measures were deployed, even though I think there probably was adequate, lubrication, if you will, in terms of, people knowing what was happening and why we were doing it, where I saw the CEO ask for certain security measures to be repealed. I guess it's like when you're a kid and you're like, oh, when I have kids of my own, I'm not going to be that way. Or, as you start to work at these different companies and you're seeing things, you sort of make these mental notes of, well, I would hate to roll something out, have the CEO be critical of it, especially if it's in the name of something important like security, and then want to have it pulled back, right? So I just made that mental note of like, if I'm ever in that role, really buddy up with the CEO and make sure that we understand that person's stance on these things, that we talk these things through before we do them. It's not uncommon for CEOs and other executives to not fully understand the value of certain cybersecurity measures. And there's a natural fear that maybe it inhibits usability or is going to slow people down. And you can choose to deploy things in a way that may do that. But I think if you burn a few more calories, you can usually find ways to either do things in a way that doesn't impede people that way, or maybe you do one thing that's like eating your vegetables, but you do another thing that tastes more like dessert. And in combination, it's much more palatable. So that was a little takeaway I had. So, Zendesk was a hugely popular company, a tremendously loyal customer base, borderline fanatic. I've never been at a company where if I was at any kind of a show and I had a badge hanging from my neck and it said Zendesk, I've never been stopped and complimented more in my life. But, they went public and somebody reached out on LinkedIn about a company called Proterra.
Syrinx has spent a lot of time and effort over the past 25 years building our reputation for quality and our brand. There was one big problem, though. No one could pronounce our name correctly.
Person on the street, brand testing, take one. Hi, can you pronounce the name of this company?
Syrinx?
That's a really good guess.
Really?
Now, how would you pronounce the name of this company?
Syrinx?
Not even close. Can you pronounce the name of this company?
Shrinks.
Luckily for us, Syrinx was acquired in 2022 by the DeWinter Group. We're rebranding Syrinx under DeWinter's highly regarded technology consulting arm, MyersBriggs Consulting Group. We bring Syrinx's deep technology delivery experience, and they bring broader delivery capabilities and a new identity as MyersBriggs.
Here's what you can count on from the unified MyersBriggs. We are now a nationwide powerhouse when it comes to technology consulting, from DevOps to developers to project managers to business systems.
So join me in welcoming our future as MyersBriggs. Hopefully people will have an easier time pronouncing this one.
How would you pronounce the name of this company?
Mars.
How would you pronounce the name of this company?
Maurice?
Is that your uncle's name? Can you pronounce the name of this company?
Mars.
That's a planet.
Maybe not.
So contact MyersBriggs today and we'll help you get your project done on time and on budget. You can call us at 408-297-7500 or you can find us on the web at MyersCG.com. That's MARISCG.com. So Proterra, they're like a cloud-based connected vehicle charger software as a service, right?
That's right. Frankly, dream come true job for me. All made possible by just the attention I was getting being part of the Zendesk IPO. They reached out. They were in the process of trying to position themselves less as an electric bus company and more as a technology company. They were moving their headquarters to the Bay Area. They had an IT team of 2 people poised for a tremendous amount of growth. So it was another opportunity to maintain being in a startup environment, but be the head of IT. Ultimately being the SVP of Information and Connected Vehicles and Chargers Technology, longest title ever. The great thing about that role was Proterra makes electric buses, transit buses, things you would take in your average urban environment, charging stations. But there's an infrastructure component. If a customer buys 300 of these things, that's a whole infrastructure project, construction, power, all those other things, right? Proterra had a great approach in wanting to address this from a 360-degree perspective. It got to the point, though, where you didn't have to convince a transit authority that they needed an electric bus. The dialogue was more about, great, what do I do? How do I charge like 50 of these things or 300 of these things? So in terms of how the company started to look at their product, one was the bus. The other was engineering and construction services for how to deal with the logistics around charging, selling an actual charger, and also very energy dense, reliable, and well-engineered heavy vehicle battery packs. And then later on, software to tie those things together. Quite a pretty impressive 360-degree portfolio in the EV space that Proterra has. They're supplying battery packs to Daimler, among others, for electric school buses. And they're very much a part of this whole EV revolution. On the IT side, it was very much what you would expect from a startup IT stand-up, if you will. They had a staff of 2 in IT. So you had to get all the infrastructure, operations, applications, cybersecurity. You had to get all those things in place. And the team did an amazing job of getting some extremely vital foundational items done very quickly. To give you an example, I'm so proud of this team. PLM, ERP with MRP, an MES system, all fully integrated in 11 months. That company went from making something like 5 buses a quarter to making, I think, 38 or 40 the quarter after they went live. Of course, it's hard. It feels messy when you're in the middle of it. But when you zoom out, that IT team laid that apps foundation, they laid an operations foundation, networks and whatnot. Not only a testament to their talent, but partially enabled by this approach we took in building the team of auditions, thinking about the dynamics. How do you not just bring in people that are individually great, but how do you make sure that people are complementing one another? I have to say, going back to that Zendesk experience that I mentioned with the CEO and security, when I was being interviewed, I talked to the CEO and I said, what are your thoughts on technology? And he started to make it clear that while he didn't really understand much about it, he knew it was important. And I said, well, based on what you're telling me about what you're trying to do, I think it's going to cost about this much. And he paused. It was definitely a number he wasn't thinking of. And he said, well, based on X, Y, and Z, I think I can pull some things out of sales and marketing. I think I can pull some things out of here. We talked more in depth about it. And I got the sense that, this person is really the sponsor that an IT leader wants to have in technology in order to be successful. His name is Ryan Popple. Unfortunately, he passed away about a year ago. Very sad. But key to accomplishing all these things was the ability to walk in Ryan's office or have Ryan sit down with my entire team and inspire them. I did want to make mention of that because it was really a dream situation with having a CEO who really believed in tech. One day I walk into Ryan Popple's office and I say, we're collecting a lot of data from these vehicles that are running around, and it's of a tremendous amount of value to the engineering team, as you can imagine. They can look at product performance and issues and things of that nature. And organically, they're helping the service organization with that data, but it's not formalized. And we really need to invest more to make that something that's scalable. The other thing that we were realizing, because this is early days in EV and it's early days in fleet EV, I've got a Tesla. I think you've got one too. I think we can all get our head around when I need to charge my car, I charge it. But if you have 50, 300, 1,000 of them, the economics, not only around how many chargers you buy, because they're very expensive, but also how much power you're consuming. And are you doing it during, peak charge hours and things of that nature? Those come into effect because those are your fuel costs. So it's much more advantageous for you to be able to leverage some logic to avoid charging at certain time periods, if you can, to maybe not charge all the way if you don't have to, based on what route that vehicle is going to run and things of that nature. And what we started to realize is connecting the charger and the bus and maybe the operational system that the operator's using through software, that's probably where this is going to go. And so we created a new group within the IT department called Connected Vehicles, tight partnership with the engineering team, as you can imagine. They're the vehicle expert. They're the firmware expert. They're the experts on and selecting the sensors. But when it comes to securing the data pipeline, landing the data, storing it hot, warm, cold, and then building custom applications to be able to manage all this, well, that was a skill set that in our particular case, we had, in the IT side. So we created this new department. That project is now, I believe, marketed as Proterra Valence. It's a SaaS offering that accompanies the portfolio. So it's an extension of those hardware products. So it's a great story for how that Proterra IT team could participate in the product itself.
Now, from there, you stay in electric, but move off of land and into the sky. What was that like?
Yeah. I mean, how boring is it that things have to comply with the laws of gravity? There was a tremendous amount of parallels between what we did at Proterra and what a company called Archer Aviation wanted to do. Archer Aviation is in the eVTOL line of business, electric, vertical, takeoff and landing. Most people don't know a whole lot about eVTOL right now, okay? These are light 4 to 5 passenger electric aircraft, much safer than a helicopter, much cheaper to operate than a helicopter, much quieter than a helicopter. Therefore, it stands to reason that we have economic viability for the flying car that we were all promised in the 50s. The how we're all going to work in the future. They have an aggressive plan to design, be in manufacture and operating these in the mid to late 20s. I'll let them do their statements, forward-looking statements covered under safe harbor, of course, but very exciting space. There's Archer Aviation, there's Joby. There are others. I would say Archer and Joby are probably the most well-capitalized, but very similar parallels in it's an electric vehicle. They're building battery packs. They've got to build the vehicle as well, similar systems, things of that nature. So after Proterra, it seemed like a logical next step to take on a similar situation. With the added twist of it has to be able to stay in the air.
They look kind of like, an overgrown drone that can carry humans and can kind of sneak in much more quietly and efficiently than a helicopter can, like to like the edge of a city. Like you always see those little helipads on like the east side of Manhattan. I can imagine that it would kind of revolutionize how many folks and how cheaply you can get in and out of a place like that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of folks that maybe they're looking it up right now. Maybe they weren't familiar with it, but trust me, your kids and grandkids are going to use these things all the time, right? In today's world, there is something called urban air mobility, which is another thing that moniker that people use for this space. Companies like Blade, to give you one example, you can get from any one of the boroughs to Manhattan. They're using traditional helicopters, so the price is a bit high. You're also in a situation where your landing points are limited because of the noise issues. So having something that is quiet opens up flight paths that don't exist today. Now, the journey, it's early days, right? So right now, these eVTOL companies are trying to get their aircraft certified by the FAA, and they're all probably going to start, with a reasonable first step. Archer is partnered with United Airlines, Joby, I believe, Delta. And so they're probably going to start with some packages where maybe you land at SFO and then you can take an Archer to San Francisco or Napa or something of that nature. But as time goes on, we will see more and more what they call vertiports that allow you to get your way from one end of a city to another, maybe even replace your commute. There's a lot of work being done to look at traffic patterns and opportunities for the most popular commute routes as well. Very exciting stuff.
That is cool. Do you have any hobbies? You still play guitar at all?
I'm a horrible guitarist today. I was able to acquire a few cars. I think we talked about that earlier. So other than being a homebody and hanging out with my girlfriend and my dog, I will get up around 4 a.m, 5 a.m, take a run through the hills here in something that's mid-engined usually. It's just me and the deer, and it's a great therapeutic kind of an experience to run some cars through the Santa Cruz Mountains and do it all before most people are awake.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. If I'm ever out there, I'm going to bum a ride.
Yeah, be my guest, man.
Any charities or causes that you're associated with or want to give a shout out to?
I definitely want to give a shout out to one. I can't take any credit for being deeply involved in this. Most of the work is done by a gentleman named Mark Egan. But I'm a member of a CIO group called CISE, C-I-S-E, Consortium of Information Systems Executives. And there's a sort of a sub-program where CISE has raised more than $1 million to date towards scholarships for underprivileged students to pursue technical degrees. There's a partnership with Merritt College in Oakland, California. And one of the things that they do to raise funds is once a year, Mark Egan conducts what's called a CIO marathon. There's a prospective presenter cost of $9,500. Tech company, software company, professional services company gets the opportunity to present to the CIOs in the CISE group, almost like a Shark Tank-y kind of thing. It's a way to get exposure to potential customers. Mark also gives them a special tutorial on how to approach selling to the CIO, which I think is really valuable. And I think there's a couple dry runs before the marathon. So we'll put a link to that under the podcast. And this Merritt College program is really impressive. If we look at the ethnicity breakdown of these students, 31% African-American, 22% white, 19% Asian, 18% Hispanic Latino, average student age 34. And there's a specific bent on the cyber side of things. So we all know that there's a need for cyber talent, way more roles than people who can fulfill them. Great opportunity for folks to take advantage. And, it puts the proverbial money where our mouths are when it comes to DEI. If you want to do something about it, you have to find ways to get people who are otherwise not involved. Historically, we're more accustomed to male-dominated workforces. That's starting to change. But as leaders, we all have to do our part. DEI doesn't happen by accident.
Excellent. Well, Joseph, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experiences with the listeners of Underserved.
Been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we'll talk to everyone soon on the next episode of Underserved.
Thank you for listening to the Underserved podcast. For more information on the topics discussed and for show notes, visit the show website, underserved.fm. And please be sure to rate, like, and subscribe to Underserved on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.